Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Today, joining Diana, we have Jon Cohan. Jon Cohan practices substance use counseling at his office in Concord, Mass., and has more than 15 years' experience in the substance use disorder and mental health field. Jon is also a professional musician, producer, engineer, and drum tech with over 150 recording credits to his name. Today, Diana and Jon will be discussing what the role of music is in healing. I am going to pass the conversation now over to Diana.
Thank you, Laura. And welcome, Jon. For the audience who is watching today, Jon and I have known each other for a very long time. And I know a snippet of his history. And I know he's a musician, and I know music plays a big part of his life. But I have never peppered him with questions about his journey and music. So I'm going to pepper today.
Pepper away.
All right. So, Jon Cohan, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm so glad to be here, Diana. Great to see you.
You too. So let's talk about a little bit about your journey, because I know it starts with music. So let's talk about that. Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, do you have 10 hours? But a big part of my journey, is rooted in music in a good way. I grew up in Michigan around the time of the golden years of Motown, and so that played a big influence. And then rock and roll came along and played a huge influence. And I wanted to be a musician, and I partially bought into the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing as a young man. I wanted those adventures. I wanted to live, like some of my heroes lived. Like, as a drummer, my early heroes, the two biggest, were two guys who passed away from substance use disorder, Keith Moon and John Bonham from The Who and Led Zeppelin. And but music, I was in another career for a while, and then into the 90s, I just got very lucky and got into a situation where I was in a band that became, semi-successful on the local level, and then got signed to a label and got to tour and got to meet a lot of my heroes. And concurrent with that, I developed an addiction to opioids. So there, the career was rising, and I was making a good living. I was working in a lot of studios as well, not with my group, but with great producers and great bands, and working as a drum tech and an engineer. And all that was kind of in the mix. And then, the opioid use came up, and that was when OxyContin was released into the population. And so that, I began to like have all my dreams come true. I was a professional musician and 24/7 in the music business, and the music business at the time, not so much so anymore, was a great place to hide out if you had a substance use disorder or if you had an issue with substances, right? Because that's what, there's no regular hours, and there's, a lot of late nights at clubs and on the road and things like that. And as my addiction progressed, it was kind of concurrent with the success of this band. And I, at one point, after a few years on the road, I did the math, and I said, you know what, this is getting in the way of my substance use. And I left the band. I left this dream gig, and I landed, back in Boston, and kind of languished for a few years, and, descended into basically, living hell. And eventually one day I was, I don't know what happened, but I realized that this wasn't tenable any longer. And I called a friend in the music business, and I said, I think I have a problem. And he said, oh, you think? Everybody knew, or a lot of people knew, But he got on the phone and he said, call me back in half an hour. And I called back in half an hour. He goes, I think I can get you a scholarship through Music Cares, which is through the Grammy Association, one of the great kind of nonprofits for recording artists. And they gave me a full scholarship, and that began my journey in recovery. And that was 2004.
And has it been a fairly straight line for you in recovery, or is it punctuated with fits and starts like a lot of people?
Early on, it was punctuated with fits and starts. I was going to self-help groups, which I still do, and I was seeing, recovery modeled by people that I really respected, and I wanted what they had, but I could not imagine living my life without substances. It was a big part of my identity, right? And as a musician, those early years, I remember playing my first gig maybe 6 months after I got out of treatment. And I played the gig. It was at a local club. It was fine. I didn't drink, I hadn't really thought of drinking. And I got home and it was midnight, and I realized, like, this is one of the reasons I did substances. I used substances because that come down after the excitement and the exhilaration. And I was looking at it differently. Now I look at it like, what a gift, what a buzz. Playing live music is, what a buzz, making art with other people and collaborating. But back then I didn't know how to manage that stuff, So a big part of my learning curve was kind of getting, understanding recovery and understanding what I needed to do and how I needed to put my maintenance for recovery, like, first before anything else. And I remember I'm laughing. It's not a funny story, but one of the first sessions I went to, I was working for, a good band. It was a recording session, in the Boston area. And I went there, and, things in the workplace in a recording session back then, at least, were different in, the workplace and other folks had. So I walked in, and on one of the guitar rigs, somebody had their outfit, their syringe and a little disc for heating up their heroin. And that's not normal, and nobody was commenting on it. And it certainly, for me, was, one of the big potholes I needed to figure out how to avoid. And how am I going to be in this environment and maintain my recovery and do it? The thing I love the most is music. So how am I going to do this, and how am I going to navigate this?
And how have you?
I think I've done it pretty well. I was really fortunate to be able to kind of design music in my life. I met through a recovery fundraiser. I met met a bunch of musicians who were still close friends. And one of the musicians I met was my wife. She wasn't my wife at the time, obviously. But over the years, I put together a band of recovering folks, and she came and sang with us. And over time we fell in love, and she's an incredible singer. Her name's Erica Rodney, and she's in long-term recovery. And so that kind of model for us was playing out with our friends who were all great musicians and successful musicians, and doing fundraisers and having a monthly gig at a place that was a recovery center, and just enjoying it that way, and still keeping my toes in the recording world. And then eventually, 4 years ago, we built a recording studio in our home. And so that has just been the greatest gift, because I'm putting the finishing touches on a record that's going to come out in the spring. But also, we get to have our friends out here and cook dinner and have Friday night music, and it's just it's lovely. And I'm this week I'm playing a gig, and I don't put myself, unfortunately, the music business still has a lot of folks who suffer from substance use disorders, right? And some of them are very good friends of mine, and they're wonderful people and amazing artists. And I try not to put myself in those situations, not because I'm necessarily afraid I'm going to lapse or something like that, more because it's difficult to get stuff done, and I'm very much like, let's work on this, let's get this done, what's next, and I love making music, and I don't like anything to get in the way of that. So I've kind of, created this magical world that I'm really fortunate to have.
This is an amazing story. And what the culmination of your experience is, and your do-gooding in the music world, has been that you are a specialist and helping other people, non-musicians as well, with their substance use disorder. Or people who happen to have substance use disorders, which is how I've now taken to calling it.
I love that. Yeah. So, another circuitous route that I could have never predicted. If you would have told me in 2004 I'd be where I am today, I would have laughed you out of the room. But yeah, I got really fortunate. I landed in a place that was working with folks in the performing arts, who had happened to have substance use disorders, right? And the wonderful thing was, through that, just through hanging around with a bunch of musicians, somebody said, you should go work at this place. And I worked at an outpatient place that both inpatient, residential and outpatient, that worked with folks with pretty severe mental health challenges that lived in the community. So we were kind of outreach people. We'd go hang out with them, maybe go to a 12-step meeting or some other type of meeting, have dinner, and just kind of model recovery and be, we were called mentors, right? And it was a great gig. And about halfway through that, I just was like, maybe I should go back to school. I had left college. I had been asked to leave college in the 70s, and I thought that it was time to go back, and I went back, and I was lucky enough to find a decent program for the CADC and LADC here in Massachusetts, and I loved it. I loved going back to school, and I loved learning, and I loved the field, and I loved working with folks. And it just took off from there. And eventually I started my own private practice. I think you and I have talked about this, but music played into that in a funny way, in the sense that, there are a lot of folks who come in through my doors, and I'm sure through yours, that are creatives as they call them. And I've been fortunate enough to kind of, create that connection with some folks who are, having a rough time through music, or through the identification of music, and really love that.
So how do let's just talk sort of nuts and bolts. You've got a young teenager who walks in your office. He's like this. His mother made him.
I've never seen that before.
Yeah, I know you've never seen that. I've never lived with that. So
I'm living with it now.
Right. So what I want to know is, how do you introduce music as a way of, number one, breaking ice, because it must be a huge icebreaker.
Yes.
How do you do that?
Well, the quickest and easiest way is when I'm sitting down with somebody the first time, I'm like, one of the things what do I need to know about you? What do you do? What do you like? Not about the substances or the trouble with the family. I get that. And a lot of that might not be pertinent to who you are as a person. And then, because I'm an older guy, a lot of them would assume, in a lot of ways, that I don't know what, the modern music is or whatever like that. And so I do like keeping up with that stuff.
I do.
Yeah. And
the language.
It's a common ground. And so I usually say, tell me about the music you like. Like, what are the last 3 songs you listen to, or 3 artists? or whatever. And a lot of folks, I think, at first are a little tenuous about it because they're assuming that I don't know. And a lot of times I don't, by the way. But I really like hip hop. I've got a son who turns me on to like really cool stuff. And I, as a drummer, yeah. And you know, and so there's a lot of that stuff, but some really wonderful music has been passed on that way. But that connection, I think, also kind of builds trust. If I can say, you know, play me a little right now, and they pull out their phone and they play it, that's a bridge, but it's also, yeah, we're creating kind of a comfortable, safe space for them.
I like it. And you're not judging the music choice,
No.
you're not judging the language in the music, which might be fairly explicit.
Can be, sure.
And
Yeah,
it isn't a mode of expressing. Particularly, I see in the newer hip hop lyrics that they can directly be relatable to somebody's struggle.
absolutely. I don't know if you and I talked about this before, but I've been talking about it recently in the sense that, like, the younger generation, they are more fluent in the language of mental health and being mindful about it. And it's so great. And you're starting to see that reflected in popular culture, right? So it's showing up in the music. It makes me really happy. You know, our generation, you didn't discuss stigmatized things like that. So yeah, through the music has been one of the great kind of lifelines. And then there's been a few clients recently I've worked with who are in early recovery in different ages that one of the, you know, part of my approach to the work is, especially for somebody in early recovery and maybe they're in post-acute withdrawal and things like that, is kind of finding the language to explain it to somebody, and then kind of leaning into it. Don't judge it, just kind of say, this is what I'm experiencing. And as somebody who's been there, I know that it feels like it's going to kill you sometimes, or it feels like the worst depression, or it feels really exhilarating, or whatever it is. But I think a lot of people struggle with describing that to the people around them. And so sometimes we'll work and I'll say, write me a song. You know, I keep a guitar in my office, and I'm a horrible guitar player, but and maybe we'll sit down, or I'll just say, you know, part of kind of, before we meet next time, just write some lyrics if you can't play anything. And the most surprising and beautiful stuff has come through that. And again, kind of that anchor into the world of recovery for them, right? Because it's something maybe they never did before. Maybe they, you know, never wrote a song, if they're, you know, musically inclined, without smoking a bunch of weed or whatever, you know, drinking. And so
Or even
that's
if they're not musically inclined, maybe they've never written a song and experienced the dopamine elevation or endorphins that come with creating music and singing music, and, you know, all of the good neurochemicals that flood us with music.
it's profound. It is profound. You know, one of the other things I recommend when we're talking about kind of, you know, riding out surfing, you know, urges and things like that, you know, one of the ways is distraction. And, you know, I just say, put on your ear pods or headphones or whatever, and listen to something you love, and try to kind of breathe and allow yourself to get into that. And you and I both know, it doesn't matter what mood we're in, we're going to listen to something that matches that, or will elevate us out of it, or that feels, you know, appropriate to what we're going through. And that has, for me, has been, and I'm not exaggerating, it's been a lifeline many times for me.
Me too.
Yeah.
My ability to access a song that can describe where I am has been a fundamental coping strategy for decades.
It's magic, and it's free, you know, which is, you don't have to, there's not a lot of, you know, skills that you have to put,
Right.
and it'll get you through. It really is a gift. And through those songwriting exercises, excuse me, through those songwriting exercises, I've gotten an insight as a treater and a reminder of, just how difficult that portion of somebody's recovery can be. And just kind of, it's also a launch pad for us discussing stuff that maybe wouldn't have come up in regular talk therapy or regular counseling.
I love that. I love it. How do you start your day with music? Do you play it in the morning?
This is, music is constantly in my head. In some ways a curse. Like I'll wake up at 3:00 in the morning and I can't even remember, whatever. It's the last thing I heard before I went to bed. Right. So this morning I'm mixing a big song right now, and it's got a lot of moving parts, and people on both coasts contributed to it. And so, I have to be mindful of the way it sounds. And so I'll give myself like something to, wet my palate, like, just something really beautiful. This morning, I was probably, a lot of people don't know it, but I was, listening to, this percussionist called Ayrto, who when he was with Miles Davis, and it's not the music I make necessarily, but there was something about Miles who, it's just like, if you want to listen to something inspiring, you're going to listen to Miles Davis, right? Because he was always moving forward. Or, yesterday it was Sly and the Family Stone.
Oh, my favorite.
The favorite.
Ooh, yeah.
And the Bill Withers thing that we listened to, Bill Withers is another one of those guys who could tap into it, like that thing. And it's just, it's the gift that keeps giving.
Mm-hmm.
We went down to New Orleans for Jazz Fest because a good friend of mine was playing down there back in April, and just immersing myself in that place. And I had spent a lot of time down there in the 90s and being in recovery there. And just, it was like, just like you said, the dopamine and all that. It was just like
music again in New Orleans.
Oh, that in and of itself was amazing. And the people and the spirit, and just filling up my spirit with that is hugely important.
Well, Jon, this has been a delightful conversation, and I love talking about music.
Me too.
I appreciate you. I appreciate the work you do and your ability to use what is so clearly important to you as a vehicle for healing. So thank you.
Thank you, Diane. It's so great to see you.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.